Welcome to Collab Conversations, the podcast where impactful discussions serve as catalysts for change. I'm your host, Sabrina Hanna, and this podcast is dedicated to advocacy and the individuals driving positive transformation in the Canadian healthcare landscape. In this episode, we are speaking with Keith McIntosh, chair of the Advocacy for Canadian Childhood Oncology Research Network, ACORN, if you've seen that abbreviation. ACORN was founded in 2014 to advocate for translational research and effective treatments to support the goal of curing childhood, adolescent, and young adult cancers. It is made up of parents from across Canada who have children with different types of cancer and the desire to help improve pediatric oncology research. Keith also has 20 years of experience of policy work in Ottawa, 12 of those in healthcare, and part of his work was working with patient groups to help understand the regulatory system from the industry perspective, and then ended up on the other side of the desk. And so, Keith, you're on the episode today because February 15th is International Childhood Cancer Day. And let's start by you telling us why it's important to raise awareness about pediatric cancer.
Well, it's important because despite how much energy and attention it sort of has, it's a topic and a subject that captures attention. Certainly, it generates a lot of funds collected, smiling bald children to raise funds for cancer research. It still is sort of a thumb on the hand, and it stands apart. Care for children with cancer stands apart from what we think about the cancer care system. It isn't really a part of it at all. And depending on which province you live in Canada, the kind of care and how far you might have to travel to get that care isn't the same kind of experience that adults have, or that we have with the adult space. And the reality is that for a lot of children, the treatment options are either brutal or and in some cases non-existent. So we need better treatments. We need more treatments, more access to research, and better outcomes for these kids.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point to make. That we see a lot of like the sick kids ads, or the bald kids that are smiling and thank you for donating, but actually we never really understand the other side of that, where they're not getting the treatment that they deserve, and the treatments that they are getting are really toxic. So like how do we change that conversation? Like how do we bring that to the forefront? It's not just about giving money for, it is going to research, but how do we say like that's just not enough, because these kids across Canada are not getting access to the drugs that they need?
Yeah, unfortunately, a very small portion of total cancer research dollars are dedicated to pediatric or adolescent, young adult cancer patients. The kinds of cancers that children get and children die from are different from, and the proportions are different from adults. Yes, the research that's conducted in adult cancers eventually translates to therapies and care for children, but we're talking years and decades for that translation to happen, and it needs to be quicker, and we need more dedicated research and attention on these cancers, particularly the ones that don't have good options for treatment.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that like translates into the pediatric cancers. So does that mean they're looking at the drugs in the adult population and then like just diminishing the dose or whatever so that it's appropriate in the pediatric population? Like, what does it mean to translate into the pediatric?
Well, that's just it. And they're kind of three buckets, three groupings, if you want. There are those cancers that occur in children that also occur in adults, and so the care and the therapies and the research are highly applicable, right? And so the goal there is to make sure that the research, the clinical trials happen both in the adult and pediatric populations. The outcomes can sometimes be different, and success rates can sometimes be different. There's a recent example where the success in the pediatric case was much better than in the adult population. So there's that's one case where it's essentially the same disease. There are other cases where molecular genomic markers or molecular pathways are driving different cancers in adults and in children. So drugs that are targeted to these genomic differences are being used for different cancers in children or other young people, but they're not the same tumor location or disease. And then third, there are pediatric diseases that have no analogs in the adult space, and so they're standalone, right, and require dedicated research, dedicated science on the origins and what's driving those cancers, and then therapies. So those, of course, would be the most difficult to target. But in the reality is in each of those cases, developing the new therapies is harder, and they're really an afterthought in terms of the system, if you want, in terms of getting access to therapies. And so we're running into situations where there really is a gap in terms of what's available as therapies, even if they've come along in development.
There are so many things that you said in that explanation that I want to ask about, but I'm going to start with this one. So it sounds to me like there is a need for pediatric specific clinical trials. Is that actually happening right now?
So yes, they are. There aren't enough, and they're not in enough places. Right. So I talked about the care model. Cancer care in Canada for children and adolescents is generally limited to the tertiary children's hospitals in the various provinces. Some satellite locations and some care can happen in those satellites, but by and large, you're traveling to the tertiary children's hospital, and depending on the province and depending on the hospital, right, they have to go through the process of opening up each and every trial, and they have resources for only so many. So when they open a trial, they're hoping that the right children walk through the door, right? So they can't open each trial that may be available and maybe running, but matching which ones are open, where, and to the families that wind up at the hospital don't always line up. So that there's an idea of improving the access to trials by either moving the kid to the trial wherever it may be, or making sure that trials are more portable so that they can get it where closer to home.
And so when you talk about the gaps in pediatric cancer, and you're talking about, like them as an afterthought and getting access to therapies, can you talk a little bit more about that? Can you give us a better understanding of what those gaps are?
Yeah. So, in some cases, the treatment and the standard protocols are pretty straightforward and are well established. And in my son's case, the newest drug that he had of 3 was approved in 1978. So, and none of the three are approved for use in children, and none of the three are approved for use to treat CNS tumors. But access to those drugs isn't complicated or difficult because they're old and well established and they're cheap. So, that kind of access is not an issue. We have the benefit of, I talked about the genomic markers and the pathways, right, and those targeted drugs that have come online and are well used in adult populations for 5, 10, approaching 20 years for some of them. In the cases where those drugs were developed for a signaling pathway in adult cancers, right? They came on market, they went through the approval and the evaluation process at the time that they entered the marketplace. Subsequent academic research identified those pathways in pediatric use and the benefits and developed standards of care and high levels of evidence of efficacy. But now they kind of stand alone, and there's no way to loop them back into the system. They went through the pathway 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and getting it now back through the system, there's no mechanism for that, right? And so we're now looking at approaching 50 drugs or more that are kind of in this limbo, and hundreds of kids over the last 5 years or more that have had these kinds of access questions. There's a pharmacist at Sick Kids who's part of the role is a drug access navigator, and there's a network of pharmacists across those tertiary hospitals working on those access questions, because the drugs and the evidence is there on use. In some cases, standard of care developed through the networks of pediatric oncologists, but the access loops don't exist. So what we need to find ways to bring those back into the loop.
Yeah, when you're prescribing a 50-year-old or almost 50-year-old medication to a child with cancer today, that is like a flagrant afterthought in the whole system. I mean, I can't imagine that the medicines that were developed 50 years ago are as, I don't want to say as effective, but they probably come with a lot more side effects than the treatments that are coming today.
They're very effective at what they do, but they're pretty brutal.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And so when you talk about the mechanism, is there like a process within HTA for these pediatric drugs? I'm saying pediatric, but they're actually not really pediatric drugs. But is there a mechanism?
Well, there was a case last year where the POGO, which is an organization, the Pediatric Oncology Group of Ontario, they in fact submitted a non-sponsor submission for a drug that was essentially in this circumstance. So they had to generate the evidence. They had to generate the HTA package to submit to CADTH to run through the PCODER process based on academic trials, academic research that was designed to demonstrate efficacy and safety. And there's been a positive recommendation out of that process, which is great, right? Because it shows that there is some pathway. It was a challenge and it was a lot of work, and now what? The product became generic at roughly the same time that this CADIF recommendation came out. So there are a couple of generic filings for the product, but that tells you the timelines that we're looking at.
And so if it's not an industry-sponsored trial, like I'm just, so these clinicians in Ontario had to do something specific, like they had to run a clinical trial to get the evidence that they needed to go through the HTA process.
Yeah, well, they ran the trial. They ran the trials to use the drug, right? Many children only get access to therapy via clinical trial, and so these academic clinical trials are really the foundation of all virtually all of the protocols and treatment protocols for children, and so making sure that the clinical trials can happen and be open in as many hospitals as possible. That's really the reason, and so and that's why moving kids around and moving kids to trials is such a big deal, and why there are organizations that both connect families to trials, but also support that travel, right? The provincial health systems generally don't provide any supports for either travel or and supported care can be a challenge too. So.
And then there also wouldn't be what you see in the adult populations, which is the patient support programs.
Yes, and so getting access to the drugs in the context of trials is another question. Is can the company provide access to those drugs? Does it happen to be on the formulary? Will the province cover it? That's a question often that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and so that's when the patient access navigator or the drug navigator becomes really important.
Yeah.
And but I have a question about, so this is a POGO, I guess, sponsored application that went through CADIF. And so does that mean that it is now, well, it went through review, and if it's accepted, and I don't know, does it go through a reimbursement process? And then like what happens? Like, does everybody across Canada except Quebec have access to it? And if those in Quebec, how would they get access to it? Do they have to go to Ontario to get it?
There is no clear path. There is no clear now what. The PCPA is certainly not designed to pick up a non-sponsored product. It's sort of an odd thing to think about, putting a generic product through the innovative product pathway because it just had a new indication recommendation through CADIF. It's not, PCPA is not really the vehicle for that. So the steps really then becomes going to each of the provinces and getting it onto the formulary for that indication, as needed.
And so who's responsible for doing that?
Well, that's effectively a clinician thing, or
So
a
clinicians
hospital
would
thing.
have to go like ask their hospital to ask to have it on the formulary.
More or less.
Yeah. Okay, sounds complicated.
Yeah. Well, even after all of that, it's complicated.
So another thing that I really would like to talk about is in 2001, in the federal budget, there was some resources allocated for the creation of a Canadian pediatric cancer consortium. I got that right? The CPCC. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. so that's a really exciting development, right? We talked about paying attention. We talked about making sure that there was a vehicle, a venue, and that it requires some attention. Federal government provided $30 million for pediatric cancer research. 23 of it was earmarked to this consortium. Recently name changed to Access, which is an acronym. And I apologize, I don't have it handy. But that $23 million was built and designed to build this consortium as a vehicle and a venue for addressing the access and care pathway nose to tail, and with some infrastructure and some capacity and some resourcing to be a hub for discussing and developing policy and supporting research, from basic biology to clinical trials, improving access to therapies, looking at the regulatory system, the research ethics, and privacy issues, as well as knowledge translation. So that's very exciting. That money and that announcement in the federal budget came out of advocacy. It was ACORN was involved. Organization called Helena's Hope was heavily involved and active. It included clinicians, it included researchers, but it really was the voice of families and of children with cancer who spoke to federal politicians and drove that funding. So it was patient advocacy and family advocacy that brought that money to reality. And it was the advocacy community that brought the clinicians and the researchers together. And helped define and set a vision for the organization to say it is possible, even if it was only 2 years and even if it was only $23 million, to identify a vision and to chart a path and say we want to take a bite of each of these apples and try to move these things along. And patients and families have been built into each of the pieces of the matrix, and it's been quite rewarding to work with the group and to have the patient and the advocate voice really embedded in the system. In fact, this was a CIHR research grant that had one proposal submitted from effectively the entire community of pediatric clinicians and researchers across the country, with patient as included as one of the PIs, it was one submission for the proposal, which is or for the call for proposals, which is not common at the very least.
Absolutely not common. So Access is Advancing Childhood Cancer Experience, Science, and Survivorship. And it's also Access in French, which is Agir contre le cancer des enfants avec succès. Like, great that they were able to keep the same acronym in English and in French.
And they're building their web presence, so that will be more accessible, if you pardon the pun, over the coming weeks.
So there are a couple of things that are really interesting. I think you said 30 million.
Yeah, seven was dedicated to a couple of other CIHR research grants focused on pediatric cancer, but the bulk of that 30 was dedicated to the consortium idea.
Yeah, and so it sounds like they're using this to uncomplicate the pediatric cancer space.
Well, to at least put it all in one place with resources. I would,
yeah.
uncomplicate is probably
It's
wishful.
too strong.
Yeah.
Probably wishful. What I find really interesting is the fact that there was just the one application and it was the whole community that came together.
It's tied to the size of the community, that it's large enough to accomplish, to bring together resources to bear, to network and to work together, both within Canada but also internationally. But it's small enough that it's possible to know virtually everybody. So there are absolutely networks of clinicians and researchers who are focused on blood cancers or CNS tumors or solid tumors, right? Have their areas of specialty. But at the same time, in the smaller centers, right, the oncologists are the oncologist, and so they will be treating whichever families walk through the door, and won't have the same degree of specialization. And that's just the reality of the community. So there are definitely the networks that exists, but there's also cross-pollination and the ability to work together, which was quite important, I think, for that to come together. And it was all about this was creating something new, the building the consortium. It wasn't about adding on incrementally to existing projects, but to build something new that was overarching, right? The same kinds of policy issues, the same kinds of access issues, the same kinds of needs tied to clinical trials and biology research really are cross-cutting. And so that really drove and motivated a lot of the work.
And so within Canada, we do also have a pediatric cancer network.
Yeah.
C17.
Yeah, C17 is an organization of representing each of those the tertiary hospitals, and provides quite a bit of centralization for supporting the opening of clinical trials and supporting clinical research, as well as a venue for discussing those issues and with the goal of supporting research and clinical trials.
There's this coming together of the clinicians and the researchers working with the advocates to move things along in pediatrics. Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, and that's another piece that's certainly different, I think, from the experience working in the adult world. Dealing and working with children with cancer is can have a profound impact on you, and having that experience, and the other thing is that there's a big void and big gaps to fill, which require a lot of work. And so the clinicians and researchers are actively answering questions for how to treat these children constantly. And so, and identifying what the research questions are, what the patient needs are, and filling those gaps is very much, it involves everybody. And so the clinicians and the researchers are closer to, or seem to be closer to, those things that are needed to be answered than may otherwise be the case in other kinds of cancer care. And so there's a community effort, whether it's the Children's Oncology Group, the COG, or PSYOP, which is the global organization or C17, then that's sort of everybody's rolling up their sleeves and trying to get to find answers. And to move the needle on something which is really quite technical, right? You need the voice of the clinicians they're the ones whose voice is going to carry the weight on what the science says. But it's the families that they look to carry a voice of why it's important, and what's important in all of this. And so being able to carry those messages together is impactful.
And so how do you use those voices to make a difference? And I mean, we were talking last week and you were telling me how there are only 3 or 4 provincial cancer plans that include a pediatric strategy. So how do you use those voices to change that?
Yeah, well, I think we now have the benefit of the consortium. We now have the benefit of access and having a venue and having resources to put a cohesive and a comprehensive voice together. There's a significant, many families who experience childhood cancer, turn around and develop or create create something as a new beginning, or to do something with that experience. Mostly motivated by the idea of making it better for the next family. Really is sort of really the driver. Most of that work, most of the organizations founded to support and to work in supporting families with children with cancer are focused on research, focused on services for families undergoing active treatment, supports for clinical trials, that we talked about, getting to trials or all of those things in terms of services, or psychosocial supports for the kids or the families. Very few focus on policy issues or access issues. For a long time, there was no access to seek out. So, the research is getting access. We are now at a place where there are enough access questions to therapies that we really need to be turning some attention to those policy questions and how to get access to these therapies that are really becoming standard of care or have high levels of evidence, but haven't fit through the right pathway.
Standard of care in other jurisdictions, not in Canada.
Well, as best care possible, with guidelines from COG or approaching standard of care, just not on formulary.
Right. So there are other jurisdictions that are trying to change the pediatric therapeutic space, and there's in the US and in the EU. Do you want to? I mean, as far as I know, that's still not happening in Canada. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so there are a number of organizations. So the regulators in Europe and the US FDA and EMA are actively pursuing pediatric pathways. Health Canada's doing similar work with improving and pushing for pediatric approvals and evidence generation. There is an organization called Accelerate that brings together industry and clinicians and researchers and the regulator community to discuss exactly those questions on designing the science, designing trials for approval, and to get the evidence needed, specifically to support those products and to bring products to market for pediatric cancers specifically. What I think is nobody's doing it right yet. I think there's a growing amount of attention to the questions, and there are companies who are including pediatric trials and pediatric components to their trials as early as the adult indications. That is occurring. I'm not sure that those products wind up with access any better than products that haven't been included at the at early stages. But I think things are, it's encouraging. I think now we have enough tangible products and enough tangible examples to identify where the current system falls down or doesn't allow these products to come through. And there's enough interest, or at least growing interest, in having conversations about creative ways of making sure that these don't stay the way they are.
Conversations with who?
Well, following the at the CADITH symposium a year ago, there was a session that discussed access to these specific access issues in terms of the kinds of things that are going on in with newer therapies, and trying to get them onto formulary for access. And so those conversations are happening. I think there is Health Canada has the pediatric drug strategy and is working actively on a number of files to improve access to pediatric indications. And I think CADITH is the door is open there, I think, to discuss these issues and to find creative ways. I think there's room there.
And what about from the industry perspective?
I think that's a key conversation that we need to be having more. Like I said, there's some of the companies are including the pediatric studies kind of as normal course. Others less so, but I don't know that it's I don't know that it's a decision that they simply don't want to. It's just not the immediate pathway. So from an access point of view, from the consortium, involving industry and including industry in these conversations is crucial. Getting the drugs available and accessible for the trials, getting drugs accessible when there is no trial, and getting access once the trials are more or less done, and the evidence base is there, how to get them onto label and then onto formularies is the question.
So then, is pharma invited to these conversations, and are they interested in having these conversations?
I think the invitations have not been as strong as they might have been, but I think that's starting to change. I think the invitations will be going out shortly, and so I certainly can't say that they've been welcomed or not. We need to take the first steps, I think, to really get pharma a part of the conversation.
Well, what do you think their willingness to come to the table will be?
I think there is an interest. Certainly, they've demonstrated a willingness to provide compassionate access, to provide drugs. Certainly within, there are strong examples. There are examples, however, of companies that where the drug is not being pursued, and then the access is not available, even if there's very strong evidence. So that exists, but it's those conversations that we need to have.
I wasn't suggesting that, pharma industry is not interested in bringing the pediatric cancer drugs to Canada, just not entirely sure that they know how to do that, or they're aware of
and I'm not sure there's any benefit. There, if you look at the fight and the struggle that they have for some products, right, for adult indications, going through the effort for a dozen or a couple of dozen children, I don't know that there's any win for them for any of this in a pathway that, if the pathway isn't clear, if the pathway for adoption and uptake is not clear, I'm not sure there's much win.
So I was going to ask, how do you incentivize pharma to bring drugs to Canada? But actually, I think we need to talk about how do we incentivize the regulators and the decision makers to create this framework, this pathway.
Yeah, we've been working on the concept of a sandbox exactly for these questions, right? The current system for approving and listing and evaluating oncology products are designed to effectively ration access in the context of adult populations. That isn't necessarily the objective or need for a system to evaluate and approve and list products for pediatric cancer, right? Nobody wants wasted money. Nobody wants to take products that don't work. But the goal of the evaluation system for adult cancer drugs is not necessarily the same goal for young people. And so, going back to the idea of a sandbox, is what needs to be evaluated, what needs to be looked at, and provide a space where rules and processes can be evaluated with the same safety and efficacy and cost effectiveness objectives, but with tools that reflect the circumstances. And so that would be regulatory and rules and processes, either at the for supporting clinical trials, supporting regulatory approval, or cost effectiveness evaluation. So, with the idea that using tools that are appropriate and suited for the evaluation and the circumstances of these drugs.
And so, is that something that the Access group is looking at?
Yeah, the idea predates Access, but it's the discussions are occurring there as well as outside. Where it will reside and how is to be determined.
Yeah, looking forward to learning more about how that rolls out. But just in terms of the provincial plans with their pediatric strategies, let's talk a little bit about that. It seems to be there's this.
Yeah. So it's a question. What do we pay attention to, right? And so your first question today is, why do we need a day or a month in September? Why do we need a day to focus our attention on pediatric cancer? And because it's different, it's treated differently, it's treated in different places. And yeah, I was recently going through trying to pull out all of the provincial cancer strategic plans or action plans or whatever. And not all of them even mention children with cancer. There are at least a few examples that don't even contemplate the notion that children or adolescents or even young adults will be treated for cancer. I will allow it for New Brunswick and PEI, considering that all of the children will travel to Halifax for care. But it tells you where it is and what people think of when they think of cancer care. Some of the provinces do have reasonably comprehensive, at least identify the issue and have stated goals for it. But you would think that it would be included, at least all of them would acknowledge it. But the reality is that the care is delivered outside of the cancer agencies, and so largely, and so it's not a budget line item, so there are no metrics or no KPIs for them, and so it doesn't get rolled into the strategy.
There's so much I want to say about that, but I'm going to start to wrap us up a little bit. I would like to hear a little bit, if you don't mind sharing, about your experience as a father with a child with cancer. And we don't have to get super personal, but I'm just wondering, because you're walking into this with a lot of knowledge, and you know how to navigate this, whereas a normal family, not that your family is not normal, but another family just wouldn't have that knowledge or that experience or the know-how.
Yeah, well, well, I've only experienced it once, and I've only experienced it with the experience that I have. But I'd read a lot of drug monographs, and I'd read a lot of CADIS documents, and so and spent a lot of time in the hospital, certainly in those early days. So I had a lot of stuff to read, and we didn't have any drug access. We didn't really have any drug access issues, certainly not from a therapeutic point of view. But we had an access issue for radiation services. And I learned about proton radiation within a few minutes of learning the kind of tumor my son had, and that it was standard of care, or certainly in the US, it's standard of care. And I learned moments later that there was no proton in Canada. I was reading a CADIS document that had been published just 2 or 3 months previous, explaining that in 5 or 10 years we might invest in a proton facility in Canada. And so I then learned that what the provincial referral process was, and I had paperwork but by the time we met our oncologist, I had an annotated bibliography on the research. I had the CADIS documents. I had the referral paperwork, and I was able to have a conversation, probably a different conversation with the oncologist than most families. And so we went to Boston for 8 weeks. My son was about one of about 10 Ontarians in 2017 to go for proton radiation. We still don't have a facility in Canada, and it isn't on the priority list of any. Well, it is now on the priority list in Ontario, and we're waiting a decision for building a center. And the province of British Columbia has identified it as something that needs to be examined and improved, but there are no plans for it. And that's frustrating, and that's a therapy and that is particularly beneficial for children, and particularly children under the age of 9 or 8 or something like that. because the effects of radiation on developing children are profound. And the benefit, but it's a service and a therapy that isn't on anybody's radar, except for a handful of clinicians who have been strongly supportive of the idea, and a handful of pediatric advocates who have experience or have seen or understand what the benefits are. So that's been a bit frustrating to pushing that rock.
Yeah, I think you'll have to come back in September so we can have a whole discussion on proton therapy, because working in the adult space, obviously I've never heard of it. I don't know that many other people have heard of it, and I'm sure that they would be pleasantly surprised by the benefits, especially in the pediatric space. But another thing that you said to me in a conversation not on the podcast was your experience as a father versus a mother with a child with cancer.
Yeah, so a child or with cancer affects the whole family profoundly. In most cases, the responses in the family it carries sort of predictable gender roles, where it's usually the mother who takes responsibility for the care and the attendance at the hospital and all of those things, and the dad manages everything else basically. They're tasked with the rest of the kids and any other children they have, or maintaining the family and trying to stay employed and all of those things. So it's a funny word, but we were blessed through this process for a variety of reasons. Our employers provided a lot of flexibility and a lot of support. So I managed to spend about 50% of the time with my son, which is not normal. I think what I said to you, it took a while for me to convince the care staff, the nurses and mostly the nurses, that I knew what I was doing. But I think at the same time I got away with not being demanding, but I got away with my own advocacy for my son more than women might get away with, without being called difficult or boss demanding, or there are a series of terms that are commonly used. So yeah, there's definitely it's a different experience as a father than what I've seen interacting with other families, what women experience. But it's yeah, I didn't know it any other way.
Anybody is listening to this podcast, what is your call to action to them?
Call to action. Well, to pay attention and to think about children and adolescents and young adults as they're affected by cancer care. We didn't talk about we talked about some of the benefits on the research side and the clinic. There are lots of benefits to how cancer care is provided in Canada for children, but we need to pay attention to it. We need continued funding for the consortium, and pay attention to the consortium. That's really the call to action, is if you have energy, if you have interest, get involved in the consortium. That's where the rubber is hitting the road in terms of driving change. And that's the goal.
And if they wanted to get involved with the consortium, how would they do that?
They do have a website. So and that's the information it will be building up.
And so the website, what I see from that access page is accessforkidscancer.ca. Is that it?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. So they should go there if they're interested in getting involved with the consortium.
Yes.
And
Or
any
they can get involved with us at Acorn,
and where would they
which
go
is
for that?
acorn.com, ac2orn.com.
Perfect. Any last thoughts?
There are many. So I will have to come back. I'm happy to come back about Proton. I'm happy to come back on any number of topics on trials or drug access.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I think what I've learned is that there's a lot of work to do in the pediatric space, and we really do need everybody to come to the table to make it happen because it is complicated. So thank you, Keith, for coming today, for educating us, and join us next time on Collab Conversations as we continue exploring the topics that are relevant today. Until then, stay curious, stay informed.